welcome once again to Caleb Likes Books. Today I am doing a very different sort of video. Usually my very different videos that I do are in some way more related to books than what this one is, and this one is still related to books. But today I am actually going to be talking about a different topic that is related in a way. That being the music genre of heavy metal. Now, for those of you who don't know, and some of you might have been able to tell by now, but for those of you who don't know, I am a big fan of heavy metal music, and I have been for about a decade now, a little more than that, ever since I was like 12, 13 years old. And some of you may have been able to tell. I noticed some of you have commented mentioning my shirts that I wear, because a lot of the shirts that I wear, this one is not one of them, but a lot of the shirts that I wear are for different bands that I like. And so some of you have noticed that, but if you haven't noticed that, I'm a big metalhead. I really like metal music. And something that I had thought about doing a video about on this channel is related to that. That being how heavily books, in particular fantasy, actually has inspired metal over the years. So I thought this would be, for me, a way to kind of talk about something different that I'm also very passionate about, while also maybe being a little bit interesting, maybe even educational in some way for those of you watching who may not be aware of this stuff, because I think it's actually super interesting, and it's something that while I didn't know about it way back when I was first getting into metal, it's something that over the years, as I've found out about it, has just made me really interested in it, and something that I just think is really cool. So first off, talking about fantasy and how it's related to metal. Something that I find really interesting is especially Tolkien. Of course, Tolkien was kind of the founder, basically, of epic fantasy books. So not only did he have a profound influence on fantasy as a genre in terms of really all forms of media, whether it be books or movies or video games or whatever, you can all kind of see that Tolkien influence in a lot of them, and in the different IPs that have been created surrounding the fantasy genre. He also had a big influence on metal, which I find really interesting. And this can go from being very kind of literal, I guess, in that some bands will use his stories as the basis for their lyrical themes, or it's more surface level, where other ones will use things from his books as like band names, for instance. Talking first about the more kind of surface level side with like band names and things like that, you have one that I have known for a long time called Amon Amarth, which the term Amon Amarth is another name for Mount Doom in Lord of the Rings. And even though the music of Amon Amarth isn't really focused in any way on Tolkien or fantasy, it is in a sense inspired by fantasy, because they predominantly talk about Norse mythology, at least in the past. Nowadays it's more about Viking culture, and in the past it was very heavily Norse mythology based. But even though they don't really talk about Tolkien and his work in their music, there's that connection there. I think the two genres of heavy metal that are the most influenced by Tolkien specifically, and fantasy in general, are power metal and black metal. And those of you who aren't metalheads probably have no idea what those things mean, and that's totally fine. I'll probably provide some examples in this video, which means this will probably get a copyright claim or two, but that's fine with me as long as the video doesn't get blocked or something. I want to be able to show what some of the stuff I'm talking about is. But anyways, to go into black metal first, because I think the influence there is a little bit more subdued, but it is definitely still there. You have, for example, a band called Gorgoroth, which is one of the big kind of original black metal bands back in the second wave of black metal in the early 90s, that kind of really originated the sound that that genre would have. And Gorgoroth is a part of Mordor, I believe, within Lord of the Rings. and they took their name from that. Even though like their lyrics don't really have anything to do with Lord of the Rings. Black metal in general and Gorgoroth in particular tend to focus on lyrical themes surrounding anti-religion or satanic themes or things like that, which are really big in black metal. But their name was taken from Tolkien. Similarly, there's another band called Burzum who came out around the same time, and Burzum is a word in the one of the languages in Lord of the Rings. I believe it's like the Orc language, which I can't remember the name of off the top of my head, but it means, I think, darkness in that language. So you have examples like that where band names in particular are taken from Tolkien, which I think is really cool. And then, of course, there's the more literal influence on the music, like when it comes to lyrical themes and things like that, which is really big, I think, more so in power metal, but there's also some in black metal. Like I said, those are kind of the two biggest influenced styles of metal, I think, when it comes to Tolkien in particular. For example, there's a black metal band called Summoning, which I actually just listened to an album of theirs in preparation for this video, because I had heard one of them a couple years ago and I didn't remember it very much, so I listened to another one just so I would have a little more to talk about. And their lyrical themes, as far as I can tell, pretty much entirely center around Tolkien and Middle-earth. For example, the album I listened to earlier was called Minas Morgul, and a lot of their lyrical themes and song titles and things are related to Lord of the Rings, which I think is really interesting. Just so you can get a sense of what they sound like, I'm going to play a sound clip here after I finish talking. It's not really very typical black metal sounding, I think. It definitely has some elements of it when it comes to the vocals, which are kind of high-pitched, screechy, even kind of at times kind of croaky sounding, which is a style that is used quite a bit in black metal. And then also the guitars are in there, but they are more in the background, and the main focus is on the programmed drums, the percussion, the vocals, and the synths, which are used, that are kind of really, the album came out, I think, in 1995, so it's like old, early 90s kind of orchestral synthesizers that sound really primitive nowadays, but I think they've got an interesting charm to them. Moving away from black metal now, we have, I think, what is probably the most heavily influenced genre by Tolkien and by fantasy in general, which is power metal. And power metal, I think, especially even in terms of just the way the genre is defined, in terms of the sound, in terms of the lyrical themes, is very obvious in terms of the influence from fantasy and from Tolkien. Because oftentimes power metal is very uplifting, very energetic. They bring in a lot of symphonic and orchestral elements, which is probably my favorite style of power metal. I really enjoy when it not only has the metal side of it, but it also has very heavy orchestration. I just think it's a really exciting sound. And in particular, one of the biggest bands within power metal is called Blind Guardian, which have entire albums kind of similar to Summoning, based on Tolkien. For example, their album Nightfall in Middle-earth takes all of the lyrical themes from the Silmarillion and tells the story of the Silmarillion within that album, which I think is really cool. I'm not exactly the biggest fan of Blind Guardian. I like a few of their albums, but I haven't listened to them very much. But I'll play a clip of them here so you kind of get a sense of what they are like. And in terms of the wider influence of fantasy, again, you have more power metal bands that are very heavily influenced by fantasy, which is one of the things that, to me, kind of made me both more interested in fantasy as well as more interested in power metal as a genre, because for several years, I kind of started getting into it around 2016, and I started out with some bands that were a little less fantasy-oriented. But as I've gotten more interested in fantasy, I have gotten more interested in the more fantasy side of power metal, which then has gotten me more interested in checking out more fantasy books because I want to see more of that influence. So I've gotten both really into power metal and fantasy as of late. A lot of the time with these bands, they will actually write their own original fantasy stories and turn them into lyrics and put them into their songs. Some of my favorite examples of this, one of the biggest examples of this is a band, Rhapsody of Fire, who have a very long career. They've been around for like 2.5 decades. They've released a lot of albums, which I have heard, I think, all but 1 or 2 of, and I really enjoy their music. They are, again, kind of that, have that orchestral influence in them, but I think they are more so inspired by the metal side of things, I think, whereas some other power metal bands go a lot heavier with the orchestral stuff, which I'll talk about some of those as well. But these guys write their own stories and put them into their music, so you're kind of getting 2 in 1. You're getting a fantasy story told to you, and you're also getting music along with it, which I just think is really cool. It's one of my favorite things about this particular style of music. And I just think it's really awesome. And I'll play a clip of one of their songs as well for you, just to show you. And then as well, like I said, some of the other bands that I enjoy that kind of do a similar thing, putting their own fantasy stories into their music, include bands like Fairyland, Ancient Bards, Twilight Force, which is probably my favorite, or at least one of my favorite power metal bands. I really love their music. You've got other ones like Dragonland and Gloryhammer, which kind of combine fantasy and sci-fi in some ways. Dragonland has 3 albums which are part of the Dragonland Chronicles, and they even have like names for groups of these albums, like Rhapsody of Fire has the Emerald Sword Saga and 1 or 2 other sagas or whatever, or series of albums. Dragonland has the Dragonland Chronicles plus a couple of other albums which are more sci-fi inspired, including their most recent one. And then Gloryhammer kind of combines a bit more sci-fi and fantasy, and they're just a really fun band as well. But like I said earlier, my favorite of the bunch is Twilight Force. They released a new album 1 or 2 weeks ago, and they're kind of, I think, the inverse in some ways of Rhapsody of Fire in terms of their sound. While I think Rhapsody of Fire goes more into the really technical side of things when it comes to the guitars and all of that stuff. Not that Twilight Force doesn't have that technicality and musicianship to it, but I think Twilight Force goes a lot heavier on the orchestral elements and the soaring vocals and the choir melodies and all this stuff. I'll play you a clip of one of their songs as well. It's super bombastic and over the top, but I absolutely love it. So that pretty much wraps up some of the stuff I wanted to talk about in terms of fantasy related to metal. I also want to very, very briefly touch on as well another side of books that I really enjoy that has influenced metal, which is H.P. Lovecraft. I've reviewed some of his work on my channel, and I really enjoy his work, and he also has influenced a lot of metal music, particularly when it comes to the heavier and darker genres of metal, like black metal and death metal. And 2 bands that I just want to mention that I really enjoy include the Great Old Ones, which are a black metal band that I really enjoy. You may have seen me wearing actually one of their shirts in some of my previous videos. I have a shirt from that band. I'll play a clip of them as well really quick. And there's also another band called Sulphur Aeon, which is a death metal band that is also inspired by Lovecraft that I enjoy. So there's a couple extra ones for you that are not fantasy, but they are still related to an author that I like. And there are even more connections between fantasy stories and books in general to heavy metal. You have bands like Iron Maiden who are inspired by like history as well as some literature, and a bunch of other bands that do similar stuff. Powerwolf is inspired by fantastical folk tales about werewolves and vampires, all this stuff. There's a ton of influence from literature in general, and especially fantasy, as well as a bit of horror as well, and even sci-fi, which I don't listen to a whole lot of sci-fi inspired metal, but I gotta check out some more of it. But it's had a huge influence on metal, and I kind of think of metal not only as a genre that I really enjoy, but it's also kind of a very nerdy genre of music, which is something that just makes me love it even more. I hope for those of you who maybe knew some of this stuff already, or even those of you who didn't, found this video at least entertaining and maybe even a bit informative. For those of you who maybe are not into metal music, maybe kind of finding it interesting how fantasy and books in general relate to it, because I think it's super cool. So that's pretty much all I got for you for this video, so thank you for watching, and I will see you guys next time.